Okay, great. I think we'll get started now. So, thank you, Winnie. And yeah, thanks for joining the first open session of the Global Shelter Cluster meeting. So we're going to be talking about a lifecycle analysis tool to assess the carbon footprint of humanitarian shelter options. And just as a heads up, this meeting is going to be recorded, so that's likely to be made available for anyone who couldn't join today. But we're going to sort of run through an update on the SMAC tool, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions and answer and a bit of discussion as well. So thank you all for joining. Now, this project has been something that we've been working on for a little while now with Kelly in Environment Community of Practice, and with WWF and BRE Trust have been kind of working together on developing this tool. And this was something that we spoke about at the last cluster meeting as well. So what we're hoping to do today is give a bit of a reminder for anyone who's not aware of what's going on, but also just a bit of an update on the progress, and also a bit of a call to action at the end for people who are interested in maybe testing the tool when that becomes available, which will be very soon. So just as a bit of a recap for most people, but as a bit of introduction as well, we were interested in looking at this issue of life cycle assessment in humanitarian response and in shelter operations in particular, as a kind of cradle to grave approach to kind of think about environmental impact throughout the life cycle of a shelter, and to be able to allow consideration of environmental impact at a global level in terms of sort of carbon equivalent emissions, in terms of looking at things that maybe don't affect just the local environment, but affect everyone in the responses and in the materials that we use. So we wanted to look at that and create something that was a relatively easy to use tool that would express its results in carbon equivalent emissions for comparative assessment between different shelter options. So we were looking at kind of the carbon footprinting agenda, and the kind of the focus on greening operations and environmental mainstreaming in operations, and thinking, what could we do to allow for people to be able to assess the relative impact that their shelter designs and shelter specifications are having in comparison to other options that might be on the table, and also to then be able to go into a bit more of a breakdown of where some of this environmental impact is coming from, and allow shelter designers to modify designs to a certain extent in order to minimize their CO2 equivalent emissions. So the kind of the end goal of the project and the tool that we've been developing is for hopefully a kind of a better shelter product that is achieved by informing decision making and helping people to think more about how the material choices that are being made, or the transport choices that are being made, are impacting the kind of the overall environmental footprint of a given shelter. And so again, this is a slide that we've used before, but as a kind of starting point for where this conversation started, and how we started to think about this, with the update of the new sphere standards, and particularly the focus on reducing environmental impact in humanitarian response, particularly in relation to things like sphere shelter standard 7, where the percentage of shelter constructions using low carbon emission construction materials and methods was one of the key indicators. We'd kind of, in our early conversations with Kelly and others that were focused on some of these issues, realized that there was quite a good level of guidance and several tools and frameworks and things that were available to support decision making related to local environmental impact, and consideration of potential issues affecting the local environment. But this kind of wider global environmental impact, thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprint, things like that, was less well addressed. But actually, one of the side effects of doing this work and of thinking a bit more about this was talking to a lot of people in the sector that are working on projects that are similar to what we're trying to do, and that's maybe something that Kelly might want to talk a little bit more about after the presentation. But one of the, I guess sort of happy side effects of what we've been doing is learning about some of these other initiatives that are complementary to what we're doing, that are thinking about life cycle assessment in a wider sense, and thinking about carbon footprint and environmental impact in a wider sense, and hopefully bringing some of those initiatives and some of those projects together, because we don't want to be recreating, reinventing the wheel. We're kind of, what we're doing is something that's very specific, and we're developing a tool that's to be used in sort of specific conditions for shelter practitioners in the field to help inform decision making. But it also feeds into some of these wider initiatives focused on environmental impact reduction and carbon footprinting that are happening elsewhere. So that's maybe something that we can talk about a bit more in the discussion. But as for our tool itself, it's based on BRE's list, which was originally developed for shop fit out in the retail sector. This is a methodology that's a kind of a simple LCA methodology that's tried and tested and available for people in the retail sector. So we wanted to kind of use that as a starting point and adapt that to something that's more suitable for shelter action, because it's tried and it's tested and we know that it works. So it seemed like it was an appropriate way to develop something to get people thinking about LCA methodologies and thinking about how this could be used more effectively in shelter action without having to start from scratch. And the idea behind it is, again, that it's easy to use, that it's a non-expert tool, that it can hopefully be picked up and used at any point, and we'll walk you through how that's done in a moment. But importantly, it's there to inform and support decision making. This isn't going to make your shelter decisions for you. It gives one very specific output in terms of CO2 equivalent emissions. So if one shelter scores much better than another or has a much lower impact in terms of CO2 equivalent impact, that's one factor, one metric that you can use to measure environmental impact. And it can be measured at any point during the shelter process to kind of not only make decisions about procurement, but also in monitoring and evaluation, in reporting to donors, and in thinking about this environmental mainstreaming approach. So we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit as well. But just to kind of get to the sort of the main discussion of today, the showcase of the SMAC tool, the shelter methodology for the assessment of carbon, which is the name that we've settled on, and looking at how this tool can be used, and hopefully it's quite easy and intuitive and quick to receive an output from. So it's an Excel-based tool, and this will be something that will be, when it's ready shortly, it will be available to download, and anyone can kind of access and use it. Again, it's a non-expert methodology. You don't need a lot of information to be able to use it and to get the required outputs. And it's designed specifically to allow comparison between different shelter specifications. So based on the bill of quantities for shelter specifications, it requires information on the component materials that go into the shelter and the quantity of those materials, the packaging that those materials come in, and the transportation distances and methods. And so that's kind of broken down into 4 stages, from kind of the country or region of source through to use and eventually disposal as well. And if you have all of that information, you can put that into the tool, and it will do some end of life considerations and calculations for you as well. And then you get your outputs. So we're going to walk you through the tool and walk you through SMAC and how it works. I'm going to hand over to Aoife now to do that. So over to you, Aoife.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so as George mentioned, there's kind of 4 major steps in the tool. As you can see here from the Excel screenshot, this is the first step. It's the green boxes are ones that you can enter your own text in for your own kind of referral back to. And the yellow boxes are the drop-down boxes for the materials. So this step is for one shelter type, and you're specifying the materials and the bills of quantities you're going to use. So in the yellow boxes there, you can see the types of materials that you might use in a shelter. And as you go down the levels from level 1 to 4, they get more specific. So as you can see in the end column number 10, at first you'll choose that you're putting maybe a some type of wood or boards into your shelter. You've chosen that it's a board, and then that board is made out of MDF. You'll then need to specify the weight for the bill of quantities for one shelter unit. So in the tool, you're comparing one shelter unit to another shelter unit. It's not multiplied by the amount of shelters that you're wishing to make overall, and that will be done at the end of the calculation. This is just for one unit compared to another single layer unit. After you've entered all of the materials for said one unit of shelter, you'll then move on to the next step, which is the packaging of the materials. And again, the green boxes are ones that you'll write in. So they're either writing your own descriptions for your own personal kind of peace of mind, or the quantity in kilograms for whatever your packaging materials are made out of. Again, only for 1 unit of shelter. This will then go forwards into the final calculation at the end. As you can see, there's parts of the calculation that are being done for you already here, which is signified by the grey boxes. So they're boxes that you don't need to worry about or write in. They're just kind of for the calculation as the score goes on. And then the final input from the user side is the transportation. So here, there's 4 options for transportation, whether it be lorry, train, ship, or air. In this example, we've said that the materials are going to travel by lorry the whole way from their country of origin to the point of arrival at a warehouse or a store unit, from the warehouse to the construction site, and then the construction site to the disposal site, if that's known. Obviously, not all of these specific areas might be known at the point of procurement, but it's just a rough estimate and guide. So if they're going to be the same for all 3 shelter options that you're comparing at any one time, you can enter the same data, or if it's more specific, you can also choose to do that. Again, in this example, the grey boxes are those which are already filled out to give you extra information on the kilograms per CO2 equivalents as the calculation goes on. And then finally, you'll get an output screen, which looks something like this. It will have a few more details on it of the CO2 equivalents per kilogram, but broadly speaking, you'll have some comparisons with shelters to shelter type. So in this example that we've put forward, shelter type 2 seems to be the one which has a higher CO2 equivalence. So I guess if everything else was the same, for shelters 1 to 3, you'd probably be looking at shelter 1 or shelter 3, as shelter 2 has over 80 more units of CO2 equivalents than shelter 1 or 3. But as well as this, it gives you quite a good indication of where that CO2 is coming from. So shelter 2, while it looks to have really high CO2 equivalents, most of the CO2 is actually coming from the transport. So at this stage, if you're able to, you might be looking at your procurement methods and seeing whether that transportation can't be changed to see if you can get those CO2 impacts down. But yeah, so broadly speaking, these are 2 of the major outputs you'll get from the tool, which is really good to compare shelters against each other in comparison, but also to see where that CO2 is coming from, to see if you can't get efficiencies from the process as it goes on to try and reduce some of the CO2 impacts from your project. But yeah, so that's broadly speaking what will be in the tool. I'll pass on to Steve.
Hiya. Yeah, so basically we're sort of coming to the beta testing stage, and we are putting another call out here for that it will be available for testing soon. And if you're interested in trialing the first version and giving it a go, and we would very much welcome any feedback off the back of those, please email George at the email there. We can also probably drop that in the chat so people have it handy, or you can email Kelly to get that as well. In terms of the development of the tool, moving forward, the whole aim is to try and make this open source, because the tool that is originally based on this is originally based on is fed by model data that is not open source. It's also for shop fit out specifically. So what we looked to try and create was a data set that was sort of representative of shelter specific materials, but also sourced from publicly available data, so that we can ensure transparency, but also accessibility to the data set that is sitting behind the calculations. So this would allow for update of this data as appropriate data sets for humanitarian materials become more widely available as, I suppose, research progresses, or as more EPDs become available. And basically the LCA data behind this tool comes from the ICE database. So the data within the ICE database is based on environmental product declarations. And so we have coupled up with this data set, as well as some EPDs that are also available across the industry. So the ICE dataset comes from averages that are collected from available EPDs for specific products, and then these are averaged out. And all EPDs are modeled off of ISO standards and EN standards. So to ensure consistency, we tried to emulate the ICE database through collecting multiple EPDs and generating sort of a proxy number that can be used in order for the calculations to be good enough for use in the shelter sphere. So this is a process that is easily replicated and can be copied and updated as more relevant and up-to-date EPDs become available. So over time, this allows for the tool to be kept sort of up to date while maintaining its functionality in terms of the calculations, and kind of use more relevant case materials as time goes on. So the tool will be kind of built with the sense that continued development can continue on with the same science sitting behind it and the same logic. So yeah, basically, and then yesterday marked the release of the roadmap for research chapter, where we also contributed a chapter into this. So if you want to go check that out, that would be great, because there's a lot of very useful information in there if you don't know about this particular piece of research, but I'm sure there's been a lot of noise within your sector. But that's all from me.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so that was a sort of a really quick run through of the SMAC tool and some of the thinking that's been going into the life cycle analysis in shelter operations. I think we've got a bit of time now for questions. Kelly, I'm not sure if there's anything you wanted to add. Oh, it's in a hand raised. So off you go, Kelly.
Yeah, sorry. My chat doesn't seem to be working, so I'll say some things I would have chatted in anyway. And then we can come back to the questions in the chat and then in the any live questions. So as George mentioned, this is one of several efforts that we discovered as we were working on the roadmap for research chapter, which, as Stephen said, was just issued yesterday. What we found is that there's increasing interest in this carbon footprinting process and CO2 equivalents related to climate change and other kinds of things. And there's a sphere standard. There are also organizations that Greening the Blue and other things that organizations are setting targets for carbon accounting. And to do that, they need to understand how much carbon they're using, for instance, to provide shelter. So this is a small tool in a much bigger process. And I want to shout out to the other participants in this overall process that we want to collaborate, including UNHCR and their sustainability and shelter effort, which is a very targeted kind of thing, looking at specific shelters in a specific place. Cratera, which is also working on something, it'll look at non-renewable fuels actually, and cost and benefit. And the university, Bath University, has been doing work on this quite elaborate set of tools. There's a university in Finland. Northwestern is also looking at this, and Penn State is involved in this kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of organizations that are starting to get involved in this, as well as I think you know the USAID packaging project and WFP, which is looking at the environmental footprint of packaging. So there's quite a lot of effort, as I said, and this is an area moving forward where we're trying to put something practical on the ground for this one tool, but we expect to continue to expand it and incorporate a lot of different things as we move forward with this effort. Thanks. I'll turn it over to George so you can answer some of the questions in the chat and when people raise their hand online. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I've seen the question about making the screen a bit bigger. I think some of the Excel sheets are probably a bit small, but we can share the slides as well after this. So maybe it makes sense we can maybe send those on and have them distributed after the session if people want to have a bit of a closer look. But again, the tool will be available soon. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, you'll be able to actually download it and play around with it yourself. So we've got a question about comparing similar products achieved with different processes. So the example given is bamboo shelter, ready-made and transported to site, compared to the same product locally produced with local material. And so yeah, so that's sort of something that the tool can do. I think in the example that we showed, the transportation was kind of the big factor that was leading to the second shelter specification having a greater impact. So things like transport distances really factor into that decision-making process. But actually, in terms of the materials themselves, and Steve, I don't know if there's any more that you want to add about this in a second, but kind of looking at how we develop the data for the specific types of materials. is kind of an interesting question, because obviously there's going to be a difference depending on which part of the world you're working in and how that particular material has been sourced. So that's something that we've tried to account for, obviously, and trying to make a tool that's simple to use and sort of hopefully globally relevant. There's some trade-offs and difficulties in deciding on how you make that data for a specific material. But I think that's kind of something that we've tried to incorporate into the tool as well as we can. Steve, do you want to talk a little bit about your sort of the Bamboo specifications?
Yeah, so in terms of that kind of, I suppose, like, data sets are hard to come by because LCA is, even in the construction industry, is quite underpopulated in terms of certified data sets, and that's why using the kind of tried and tested ISO based in EN standard approach is kind of the most legitimate way of going about it. So as things progress into the future, there's definitely going to be ways of incorporating data sets that will be very much more representative of what you're working with, but this kind of good enough proxy is what we're kind of working with at the moment. But you can definitely do this in terms of the Bamboo kind of shelter if you know the weight and the size and the amount of materials that are going into it, and then comparing that against another shelter option, and then using that with the comparable graphs that you have that Aoife showed. You could be able to see what the impact of kind of transporting a ready-made shelter across a long distance versus creating a shelter close by.
Sure. And I've seen Amar, you've got a hand up. Have you got a question or a comment?
Yeah. Thank you, Foden. Thank you all for this nice presentation. I'm curious on one topic about the calculator. As has been done, the shelter and sustainability, we find that the transport, for example, it's playing a big role in the carbon footprint. Depends on the material, locally or imported. The end lifespan recycling is an important, the material itself. But during the 18 different shelter has been analyzed with the life cycle analysis, we find that the packaging are playing a good role in the NFI for the blanket, kitchen set, other NFI items, but in the construction material to the shelter itself was less than 3%. So I'm wondering how the calculator take the packaging for the construction material as one of the criteria. And if you have an estimation, how much percentage of CO2 from the packaging it came to the shelter? For our calculation came less than 3%, so it was eliminated because it's not an important factor. But thank you so much for all. Over.
Sure. Yeah. So I think just on the kind of the packaging issue, I mean, what we've tried to do is incorporate kind of, and again, it's a simple kind of calculation that works in the same way as the sort of component materials calculation. And in the examples that we gave, packaging actually accounted for a fair chunk of the proportion of the shelter options. That may not be in kind of using, and that's why we're looking for people to test the tool and give us feedback on things like that, because the more kind of examples we have of shelters in there, we start to get a clearer view of what kind of proportion that makes up. But one of the key points that we're thinking about is that if you're noticing that for most shelters it is causing just up to maybe 3% of the impact, but actually in one shelter type for some reason it's causing more, and it's a relatively easy fix, it might be a relatively minor reduction in the overall impact, but for the sake of finding a way to remove that packaging in the procurement process or in the shipping process, it might still be worth doing. So the idea is that even if it's only a tiny impact that is being had, if that's something that you can calculate and see, then it's still something that opens the door to discussion about whether it's worth pursuing a reduction in that type of packaging that you're using. So it's not necessarily, I guess, the always going to be the most important part of the calculation or the most important part of the tool that you're filling out, and maybe issues like what comes into the component materials and the sort of components that you're using might be the area of output that you're focusing more effort into understanding and thinking about where it helps to reduce impact there, and you might not worry about packaging. But it's just a way to another kind of area to think about when we're thinking about how we're moving materials across and how we're getting them to site. And so yeah, it's not necessarily the biggest proportion of impact, but it is something that we think is kind of important to note. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but Kelly, I've seen you've got a hand up. Was that
yeah, one thing? Yes, thanks. One thing I want to point out, and I think I can answer some of Olivier's questions as well. We conceive of this as a decision support tool, so it's not going to be the deciding input into a decision of what type of shelter or not to use. It may be that flying shelter materials in is necessary to save lives and maintain livelihoods. So it's one more part of that process of making decisions. An example that Olivier gives is, well, what happens if you want to source wood locally because it has a lower carbon impact, but that could destroy the forest? That's a very valid point, and we would hope that people would raise that question when they're looking at the options, that they make those kinds of decisions. In the chapter that we talked about in the R4R research, the next step in this whole process that we've put forward is developing a scorecard approach, which is used in the industry, and would look at balancing these different kinds of issues that go beyond simply the CO2 footprint or CO2 equivalent footprint of materials and the process involved in getting those materials to a construction site, and start looking at some of these broader decisions. We know that Northwestern University, I think, and Cratera actually are working on tools that would be much more directed in terms of supporting actual decisions, going through all the different elements of the costs and the CO2 and the renewable fuels and all these other kinds of things. But at this point, those are not well adapted. At least the one from Northwestern is not well adapted to Northwestern and Bath are both working on this. They're not well adapted to the emergency response where you have to make a decision in two or 3 days. Whereas this is a decision support tool that's supposed to be used in that kind of context. So it's not the only tool that could be used, and there's certainly a lot more room for expansion and improving the input of an assessment tool into the decision-making process. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of add on to that and address some of Olivia, some of your questions as well. I think that yeah, this kind of it does focus on the CO2 equivalent emissions. That's kind of the idea behind that, was that the CO2 equivalent emissions can be used as a kind of proxy for environmental impact more widely. So it's not by no means is it a perfect measure, but when you're trying to do a detailed, complex sort of LCA overall environmental impact assessment of what any sort of construction entails, that gets very complex and very detailed and a lot of hard work very quickly, that even in mainstream construction where they've got all the money and time in the world, it's not necessarily done very well or done to a way that you get outputs that can be acted upon. So what we're doing is trying to take some of those principles but apply that in a more simplified way to get an output that is a proxy for some of that with all the caveats attached. So the tool just measures CO2 equivalent emissions, and it doesn't consider things like using wood from a forest that might cause to deforestation and things like that. But what we're hoping is that using that proxy shows one element of what might go into environmental impact, and it's starting to think about it. It starts to open that conversation for people to kind of start to ask those questions and think about, okay, so maybe that shelter too in the example we showed has a much higher carbon impact, and that's because of the transport. That's probably because it's being transported from further afield than some of the other shelters or something like that. Is that an acceptable trade-off if it's going to mean that the local forests are not going to be damaged, or there's going to be less local environmental impact as a result? So really, it's a tool to give one proxy metric that can help to inform decision making, and also can be used in kind of the reporting and monitoring process to say, this is something that we've considered and this is why we've made this decision. So it helps in reporting back to donors, who are again talking more now than they ever were before about things like environmental impact and how that might lead to then kind of expectations that donors have for organisations that are implementing in the field. So it's designed to inform the decision, and it's basically designed to start that conversation. And I think that's kind of where we've got to with the tool, and the roadmap for research chapter that Stephen mentioned, that goes into a bit more detail of what we see as the next steps. And I think it's things like from what you're saying, Olivier, what you're saying in terms of what Criteria are doing and things that UNHCR are doing. That's kind of the next step along. That's maybe building this into a decision-making process. So this is the first step on that journey, I think. So we've had a couple more questions rolling in. Yeah, so I see Olivier's another comment there about making the tool user-friendly and trying to take into account economic impact and things like that. And I think that's something that again, it's kind of been interesting in having the discussion and catching up with other groups that are working on this. And Kelly mentioned some. Bath University, the Healthy Housing for the Displaced team there have done a lot of work on various issues related to shelter. They actually have a carbon calculator tool as well that does cradle to gate calculations. And they're also looking at things like thermal comfort and other impacts on shelters, and they go into quite a lot of detail with quite a few different tools looking at things like that. What we would like to see and hope kind of coming forward is that actually if we can connect some of these initiatives up, each of these tools is kind of complementary as far as I see it, and I think that they can all kind of address different elements of this overall environmental impact question. And I think that it'd be great to follow up and have a deeper conversation about this in the future, because I think that's the natural progression of this is to address some of those other environmental concerns as well. Miriam, I see you've got your hand up. Have you got a question?
Yes, thank you. Well, rather it's just I'm trying to connect a few dots here. You would tell me it's a little bit of a stretch, but I think like the findings from these tools can also inform other decisions, such as what is feasible in terms of the expected percentage of a project budget to be spent on goods and services produced in the host country economy. Sometimes we get these requirements. So, and I think we can consider different modalities. So not only from direct procurement, but also through cash, where we support the local market, but not necessarily beneficiaries will buy construction materials produced in the country. So mud brick might be produced locally, but galvanized iron sheets might come from abroad. So what I'm talking is that the findings, the conclusions, not necessarily the tool, are quite relevant for other broader discussions about the impact of the materials against their durability and against, so their lifespan, the environmental impact, what is more suitable, what is provides better quality housing. So I'm just kind of, with your presentation, all these thoughts are in my mind, but if you write or continue to elaborate on these recommendations, conclusions, and the more we use, the more that we can use, elaborate this, I think is quite relevant. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. And I think that's kind of what we were hoping for with the tool, was again just by having kind of this basic output that can be used in reporting and in monitoring and evaluation programs and things like that. It just adds an extra piece of evidence that, one, the sphere standards is kind of starting to suggest we should be looking at, and also that increasingly donors are starting to talk about. So I see it as being something that can feed into and start that conversation around, as you say, it might be more expensive to source locally, but if you can say, well, actually it has this benefit economically and it also has potentially this benefit from an environmental perspective, it's just more evidence that can kind of lead into that kind of decision making, which is how we kind of hope that the tool will be useful and can be used. And that's why we wanted to keep the methodology itself quite simple, because this isn't something that's going to make or break a decision, but it is something that if you can do it quite quickly, it adds another string to your bow in terms of talking about why you've chosen a specific shelter type. So yes, I think that's exactly what we'd like to see it used for. There's a question here from Patrick as well on besides CO2 emission, does the tool also measure the impact of the materials degrading in the environment? And so the output is on CO2 equivalent emissions, so we don't necessarily have that element of it is not necessarily measured as well. Again, some of this is incorporated into some of the calculations in terms of thinking about end of life and elements like that, but it's not an explicit measurement that we're considering, and the overall thing that we're looking at is specifically CO2 emissions. So, oh, Stephen, have you got something to?
Yeah, no, it's just on that, because it's that like this tool is focusing on embodied carbon as the kind of precursor to start the sort of development of the tool. That kind of degradation of materials to the surrounding environment is more of a sort of I suppose more complex development, and you would need more specific data about the specific products going into it, because a good enough proxy might be misleading in terms of the kind of degradation in that kind of sense of the term. So that could be something that could be incorporated. Yeah, as you're saying, microplastics, that kind of data could be a huge benefit to the tool and further development in the future. So maybe that's something to keep in the pipeline, whereas this is primarily focused on embodied carbon of shelter options right now.
Also, I would note that there are other tools out there. I mean, there's the NEAT Plus, there are a number of other environmental assessment impact tools. This is a relatively, as I think we mentioned at the beginning, this is a relatively narrow focus looking just at shelter. And obviously, we want to discuss expanding the tool to consider a lot of other factors. And we know, as we've been mentioning several times, other universities and other partners have been doing this. Crater specifically has been looking at economic issues as well. What we do find, though, and from experience over the last couple of decades, is that there's a trade-off between accuracy and timeliness. And as you get more and more data demands and more trying to be more and more accurate and more inclusive of other factors, you end up running out of time to make the decisions that you need to make on an urgent basis. So we don't want this to be seen as trying to do more than it's supposed to designed to do. But we think it's an interesting entry point for all these other discussions, and recognize that a lot of other people are doing similar things, and we want to have a collaboration moving forward. We think that's the best way. Thanks.
I think just looking at Florian, your comment there as well about moving towards user-driven provision of shelter and moving away from kind of shelter models. I think that again, part of the reason that we wanted that to have the tool kind of in this sort of open access way with kind of this this setup that means that materials can be added to it and things can be changed within the tool down the line is in order to address basically that it does allow you to look at things like, if I swap out this component for a different component, what impact does that have on the overall impact? So, you know, it's not you're not just comparing the full shelter specification in terms of the whole shelter model. You are actually, in effect, able to compare different components. So we're hoping that the flexibility of the tool allows for an approach that addresses some of those things, and hopefully that's hopefully what people will find in testing it and giving some feedback on that, because that's what we're hoping we can help to address, is that more flexible approach towards shelter materials.
Coming to, so Ellis sent a message in the chat. This is an Excel-based document tool, and so unless Stephen frowns considerably here, yes, it can be translated. We can just change the words in the Excel document. The training that BRE is putting together, I think that might be a little bit more difficult to translate. It would need a professional work, and the training materials would have to be redone in another language. But I am finding that Google's pretty good at translating things just word to word. So that's something that we can put on the agenda of things we can do in the future in developing tool. But we do want to do a little bit of testing with it, or practical use. I wouldn't say testing, it's practical use with it, to see what needs to be adjusted, because particularly we end up with some changes, some need to make sure the words used are appropriate for the field shelter context, as opposed to abbreviations or other terminology that the people in the field may not want to, may not understand. I guess we're coming to the final point, George, and we need to see if there are any final questions or you have any final comments.
Yeah, I guess if there's any final questions or anything that we haven't addressed in the chat that we've missed, please do speak up, and we can answer any final questions. And if not, then I think that thank you all for listening. Again, we're expecting this final version of the tool, the Excel version, to be ready in the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested in having a play around with it, testing it, giving some feedback on it, then please do get in contact. You can send an email to any of us or to Kelly, and we can kind of share that with you when it's ready, and we'll be sure to update the cluster and everyone when the tool is available. So that's kind of the next step, and hopefully this is something that's useful. And yeah, please do reach out if there's any questions that we haven't answered, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you very much.